I'd like to welcome you all to the sixth and final session of the speaker series by Hamilton Wenham League of Women Voters. First, let me mention that the League will also be recording another candidates night this year on April 4th. You'll be able to get the recording on the League website shortly afterwards. And we'd love to have you submit questions to the candidates and the contested candidate races. There are only two. There's one in Hamilton for the Board of Select people and one in Wenham. And there are two candidates in Wenham for one seat and three candidates in Hamilton for two seats. The Hamilton ballot does include 4 names for 2 positions on the planning board. However, 2 people from that list of candidates have withdrawn their names, and the 2 remaining candidates for the Hamilton Planning Board are Jonathan Poor and Darcy Dale. Make sure you do your civic duty and attend town meeting on April 6th. It will be in Hamilton at 9 a.m. and in Wenham at 1 p.m. Don't forget to vote on April 11. The League tries to keep you informed and help you perform your civic duties, understanding the issues, and we always welcome new members. Tonight's talk on water and where does your water come from is brought to you by the League of Women Voters and the Ipswich River Watershed Association. I'd like to introduce to you our first speaker, Erin Bonnie Casey, a water management professional from the IRWA. She is director of their resiliency program. She received a BA from Bates and Masters of Science in Water Science, Policy, and Management from Oxford University. She's a native New Englander and previously engaged in market research in the water sector, and now focuses on implementing river resiliency plans and actions. Senator Bruce Tarr needs very little introduction, as he's been our state senator since 2011. And known for his ability to understand and develop policy. I'm quite certain he'll have an interesting perspective on water for us. Our final speaker really doesn't need an introduction either. Kristen Kasner, our state rep for the 2nd District, happens to live in Hamilton and be a member of the League of Women Voters. She is a planning professional with 20 years of local government experience. She has dedicated her career to improve the quality of life for people in their environments in the Commonwealth. I'd also like to thank HWCAM for recording this evening's proceedings. We definitely have an interesting evening in front of us. Let's get started. Erin?
So thank you all so much for having us tonight and for coming out to talk about this. The League of Women Voters got in touch with IRWA a few months ago because they wanted to be sure to include something about water in their speaker series this year because this is such a hot topic for these communities. And it's something that I'm always happy to talk about, so we're just thrilled to be able to do this tonight. I'm going to start off and give you guys a little bit of a brief kind of background and set the stage of what is going on with water in Hamilton and Wenham, and then I'm going to turn it over to our legislators to talk about kind of where we're going and what they're doing and working on this issue. So very briefly, Ipswich River Watershed Association, I will refer to as IRWA by our acronym, so that's what I'm talking about when I say IRWA. We are a group of citizens, scientists, businesses, and communities concerned about the health of the Ipswich River and its watershed. Our mission is to protect and restore the Ipswich River and its watershed. And as a reminder, for those of you who might not remember what a watershed is from way back in, I think, 5th grade science is when you learn watershed. A watershed is an area of land that all drains to the same body of water. So in this case, the Ipswich River. If a raindrop falls anywhere within this white area, it eventually makes its way either into the ground and then through the groundwater table, or across the land and then goes downhill. Water always goes downhill, and ends up in the Ipswich River and eventually makes its way to the ocean right by Crane Beach. In Hamilton and Wenham, you guys might be more familiar with the Miles River, which runs through the middle of your communities. The Miles River is a tributary of the Ipswich River. It's, in fact, its largest tributary. So when we refer to the Ipswich River watershed, we are including the Miles River as part of that connected network. So to the point of today's talk, where does your water come from? Does anyone know where the drinking water for either Hamilton or Wenham is sourced? Oh, good. We all get to learn something tonight. So Hamilton and Wenham, each town has their own separate drinking water supply system. It's run by the town. Both of them pull water out of wells. Hamilton's wells are down here, this group, as well as over there. These green dots are wells. So the cluster on this side is pulling from Idlewild Brook, which flows straight into the Ipswich River. On the wells on the other side of the map are closer to the Miles River and are pulling out of groundwater that's connected to that watershed. Wenham gets its water from these wells right here, near Pleasant Pond, which is near the Wenham Swamp, which is also connected to the Ipswich River. So your water supplies are really directly connected to both of those watersheds, the Ipswich and the Miles River subwatershed. When it comes to water supply in Hamilton and Wenham, I also always like to mention the Salem-Beverly Water Supply Board, because Wenham Lake is the reservoir for the Salem-Beverly Water Supply Board. So, as the name suggests, that water board supplies water to the cities of Salem and Beverly. It was established in 1913, but the decision to protect and conserve Wenham Lake as a water supply source for the city of Salem was made way back in 1864 by the Massachusetts State Legislature. And I wanted to mention this for two reasons. One is because I get so many calls every year from residents of Wenham and people who drive along 1A about the water levels in Wenham Lake. And while Wenham Lake is a naturally occurring body of water, it is a natural lake, it's currently managed as a drinking water reservoir. And so the levels in that lake are a reflection of the operations of the Salem-Beverly Water Supply Board. And they're fairly disconnected from how much or how little it rains. And so that's why when you're driving by, it might not make sense how much water you see in the lake. The other reason I point this out is because I always am struck by this date, 1864, because the water supply in this region is incredibly complicated. And the world is quite different than it was in 1864, back in the middle of the Civil War. But we are still operating within a framework that was established back then, and that makes water supply decisions for the future quite tricky. So when we think about why things are the way they are, we have to go back and look at the people who were in the legislature at that time and made those decisions under a very different context, and we still work within those decisions today. So for the Ipswich River Watershed Association, the question of water supplies is really important because in 2021, the Ipswich River was named one of the 10 most endangered in the United States, which may be surprising because our country includes rivers like the Colorado that run through desert states. Some of these rivers are considered endangered because they're very polluted, which is not the case with our river. But our river makes this list because even though it is a little river, it only goes from Burlington, Massachusetts to Crane Beach. It supplies 350,000 people with drinking water every day. So there is an incredible amount of pressure on our river, both in terms of the water that we're taking out of the river and the watershed for human needs, and also on the fact that the river has to stay clean enough and plentiful enough to supply all of those people. Complicating this is the fact that because of climate change, we're seeing an increasing incidence of drought, and they're becoming increasingly severe. So we had droughts of record in 2016, 2020, and 2022, and we saw stretches of the main stem of the Ipswich River actually go dry. This is extremely atypical for rivers in New England to just run fully dry, and it reflects both the climatic reality that we're now experiencing and the human-induced pressures that we put on the river from water withdrawals and the way that the land in the watershed has been developing. I don't believe that a PowerPoint is complete without at least one bar graph, so I have just a couple in here for you. So this is water supplies for Hamilton, and then I'll show Wenham. This is between 2020 and 2021. Hamilton sends out its water bills quarterly, so that's why these dates are quarterly. And what I really want to highlight here is every quarter, you can see that there's a huge spike in water use for these middle two quarters, which are the growing season. So we know that water use in the summer months spikes fairly dramatically. And what do we use water for in the summer that we don't use it for in the winter? Lawns and swimming pools. And so we can kind of surmise that this additional water demand that we see in the summer is for lawns and swimming pools. I'll also note that this water is water provided by the town of Hamilton. Most farms in the region have their own wells, so they would not be included in this data. So all of this spike is pretty much just residential water use consumption increases. And the same thing holds true for Wenham. The dates are slightly different, but the summer months are those middle two bars, and you can see water use dramatically increases. This is also a challenge because the rivers are naturally at their lowest in the summer. And we're seeing droughts which occur in the summer. So this is Hamilton and Wenham water use in drought years. So 2020 and 2022, both of which were droughts of record. And you can see that our water use in our homes is significantly higher, even in the middle of a drought. So when the river is under stress, we put more pressure on it by pulling water out during those drought months. So the takeaway that I want all of you to think about when you're leaving here based on those charts is that the decisions that we make in our own homes and gardens collectively has a huge impact on the health of the river and the watershed as a whole. We always encourage people to think very carefully about their outdoor water use. Sprinkler systems, for example, use about 1,000 gallons of water per hour. And because your wells are hydrologically connected to the Miles River, the Ipswich River, the Wenham Swamp, and local ponds, that water is essentially coming straight out of those water bodies. So there is a trade-off, and we really encourage people to try and reduce the amount of water that they're putting on their lawns and leave it in the environment where it can benefit the ecology. And with that, so we have a website, ipswichriver.org. Our water conservation page is /waterconservation. And you can check that out for tips on how you can conserve water and take action in your community. And with that segue, I'm going to turn it over to Senator Tarr to talk about what he's doing. We're really fortunate to have a very supportive legislative delegation in this region that have been working very actively on the issue of water supplies.
All right. All right, well, first of all, thank you all for coming out tonight. It's great to see so much interest in an issue that is so important to all of us and one that can seem a bit intimidating. And it's important that we all have a basic understanding of it and then commit ourselves to working together, because there are solutions to be able to address the problems that we face. They are complicated, they are not inexpensive, but they are possible. And I always like to remind everyone of that, because we wouldn't want to be in a situation where we identified a problem and weren't able to present to you a series of solutions. I want to begin by thanking the League of Women Voters and Ipswich River Watershed Association for bringing us here together tonight for one of the most important issues that we face in Hamilton and Wenham and all across the North Shore relative to the situation of sustainable drinking water supplies. And I particularly want to thank Erin for her work on behalf of the Ipswich River Watershed Association in helping to drive the conversation that I'm going to tell you about a little bit tonight. And I think it's important that Erin really set the stage so that we understand, when we think about water and our drinking water, that it comes from very localized sources. There is no magical pipe that comes onto the North Shore that we all tap into that we can make a phone call and say, send us some more water down the line. What you see in those slides that Aaron presented is what we have to deal with, at least for right now. And that's an important concept for us all to be able to understand here. And of course, as has been discussed a little bit already, the sources that we depend on are subject to a lot of important factors that affect their resilience and their reliability. And I think also it's important to note that one of the reasons that we care about that is not just because of the water that we need as human beings, but also because there's an ecosystem at risk here. And that ecosystem depends on adequate stream flows so that the health of the river can be maintained. And when you see what happens in a drought condition in some of those slides, it's easy to understand that the ecosystem of the river in a summer drought condition is not doing well. So all of that, I know, paints a little bit of a grim picture. That's not my intention. So the story that I'm going to tell tonight goes back to 2015, 2016. And there were a group of legislators that began talking about the fact that in the legislature and in state government and in our communities, oftentimes we don't start talking about a drought until we're in one. And yet there are significant periods of time that elapse sometimes between those droughts in which we do nothing. And then a drought occurs again and we say, oh, gee, what could we have done about that? And we decided, and by the way, credit here to former Representative Hill, I think probably most people in this room know him, and former Representative Ted Speliotis, and many people in this room probably know him as well. And so we started discussing the fact that this was a situation where no one community could successfully address the problem alone. And we needed to begin a region-wide conversation within the watershed that Aaron described about what we could do to use that time in between droughts to prevent the next one from happening. And so we decided to make a conscious decision to try to move the entire region from a reactive mode to a proactive mode. And initially, those conversations, which were very informal, involved information sharing. We would get folks together. We would share information about drought management plans, about the state's drought management infrastructure and system, about things like MS3 and MS4, the permits that deal with what we do with stormwater that's collected through our drains. So a lot of information like that was exchanged. And we were really gaining some steam. And then something called the COVID-19 pandemic struck. And really, it caused us to cease all of the operations of the nation task force, and we were put on hold for a while. As we were coming out of COVID-19, there was a different discussion. And the discussion was, we've done a lot of information sharing, we've had some great conversations, now it's time to be more intentional and to move from a stage of sharing information to a stage of charting a course for action. And so essentially the task force was reborn after the COVID-19 pandemic, and it had a much different, more focused approach to dealing with the issues that we face. And so it's important to understand that there are 18 public water suppliers that depend on this watershed. 18 very different communities or water districts, all with some degree of autonomy, and a group that has not historically had the opportunity to work together and be in common discussion. It's also important to understand that we have great environmental organizations like the Ipswich River Watershed Association. And unfortunately, there had not always been a lot of conversation across the table between those groups. And in fact, in some cases, it was considered to be an adversarial relationship. And so we set out with a new mission and a new focus to try to bring every single stakeholder to the table. That means the Watershed Association, some other environmental, non-governmental organizations, every public water supplier. That would be the core group. And beyond that core group would be other folks that could contribute to the conversation, but that weren't necessarily direct stakeholders. And what do I mean by that? Well, the federal legislative delegation, other organizations, Salem Coast Watch, the Middleton Stream Team, whole host of other organizations that could inform the conversation, but that weren't direct stakeholders. And I am so pleased to tell you that last fall, in 2022, for the first time in the history of this region, every one of those stakeholders signed a charter statement to work together as the North Shore Water Resiliency Task Force. It had never happened before. And it took an incredible amount of work. The legislators in the region, we act as the conveners. I act as the chair. And we pull folks together, but it's very important to understand a guiding principle of this group is that it does not represent a top-down approach. So for instance, at our meetings, we have participation from our federal legislative delegation. They're very well represented. We have representation from Mass DEP and Mass DCR and a group of organizations, but it has always been clear that the decisions of the group will be made by the stakeholders directly and will not be handed down as an edict from folks at other levels of government. And that's really important to remember as I continue to work through this with you. So we signed a charter statement. It's very soon going to be available online. I would encourage you to read it. It's a very interesting document. It's not painfully long, and it sets out a lot of the guiding principles of the organization. But without getting into those, I'm going to tell you about two. And they're co-equal, and that's another important concept. So goal number one is to ensure that we have reliable drinking water supplies for everyone that depends on them. Goal number two is to protect and strengthen the ecosystem of the Ipswich River and the Ipswich River watershed. And it was an important thing for us to make a statement together in the region that those two things are co-equal. One is not superior to the other. And as we move forward together, we have to achieve both of those goals and not consider them to be mutually exclusive. We agreed to that. And we agreed to a charter statement that everyone has signed, and we continue to have meetings. Sometimes they're in person at the Essex Agricultural and Technical School. Sometimes they're by Zoom, depending on the subject matter and the logistics that we have to address. So we committed ourselves to that, and we set a course to try to pursue those two overarching goals. And then the question was, how do we best achieve that? What are the methodologies that we can use? What are the issues that we're going to consider? And so we have embarked on a series of actions that are certainly not going to be the last series of actions, but they're the first ones that we prioritized to be able to move forward. And so they basically fall into three categories. Number one, trying to increase the supply of water into the watershed. So Erin mentioned the fact that the water here in the watershed, I keep pointing over here even though those slides are gone, but pretend they still are there. But the idea was that we only have a finite amount of water. Now there's important issues within that. Number one is we lose a lot of water that goes out into the ocean that isn't kept to recharge the aquifer. And that happens for a variety of reasons. Certainly irrigation and lawns are one. Another one is that we are heavily dependent on septic systems as opposed to centralized sewage treatment. And so oftentimes the water goes into the ground. We don't know where it goes after that. But when it does go to centralized treatment, then we lose it into the Atlantic Ocean again. So we have a finite amount of water and we have to protect it. But the thought was, how can we increase supplies of water into the region so that we're not only relying on withdrawals from the Ipswich River, either directly or indirectly, to supply the water that we need. The second concept was, how do we interconnect the communities in the region so that we can share water, so that we can use it efficiently, rather than having one community have an overburdened well and another community maybe have some surplus and no ability to share that water. That was one reason. The second reason was, if we are going to bring additional supply into the region, we need to be able to share it. And sometimes the water professionals will call that wheeling. We want to wheel water through the communities so that everyone can share in additional sources that we find. And then the third goal, really, or the third sub-goal is, what do we do about conservation? So we talk a lot about supply, we talk a lot about interconnection, but we also need to focus on conservation because the water we save is as important as the water we import into the watershed. And so with those three immediate goals, we set out on a course. And the course was to be able to find funding, be able to create subcommittees that can deal with allocation of that funding, and then move to action. Well, obviously the hardest thing is usually finding funding. And in this case, we've been extremely successful. So in fiscal year 2022, 2023, and the current fiscal year 2024, if you put them all together, we have been able to secure through the legislative delegation $400,000 for the work of this effort. That is not insignificant. And it's been fueling our efforts. Again, I feel like a scene from Star Trek, to go where no one has gone before. And we are going there. And also, to borrow a line from Star Trek, we're going boldly there. This is not a half-hearted effort. We're going full steam ahead. So in order to allocate those $400,000, we set up 3 subcommittees. One is relatively new. The other 2 had been in existence for a while. The first one was to determine how to spend that money on the projects that we would identify as being priorities. And this is a good point for me to tell you how incredibly valuable the Metropolitan Area Planning Commission has been to this effort. They receive the money, they manage the contracts, and we have 2 representatives from MAPC who are the facilitators of the group. So we have Leah Robbins and Martin Pillsbury from MAPC, who are our facilitators that help facilitate the conversations and keep them moving. And that's a very important role and help us to make decisions in the appropriate way. And the third person is Sarah Cohen from the Department of Conservation and Recreation, who also acts as a facilitator of this group. So they facilitated the conversations so far, and we expect they will continue to do so in the future. So the first subgroup said, okay, let's look at the money that we have and look at the tasks that we want to undertake. And basically, we identified a couple of tasks. Number 1, let's look at the situation about whether or not we can bring additional water into the watershed. And basically, we're looking preliminarily at 2 ways to do that. One is by constructing a reservoir, a very large surface body of water that would serve the region. And more specifically, we're looking at a site in Topsfield that is actually owned by the Beverly-Salem Water Board. The Beverly-Salem Water Board in the 1960s purchased land in Topsfield that is a natural basin. And the idea behind that was someday we're going to need more water. So we're going to purchase this land, we're going to study its topography, and we're going to set the stage someday for the creation of a reservoir. And there were even some preliminary studies on that, but it was largely an idea that had been gathering dust on the shelf. We are revisiting it to see, is that a practical way to address the situation? Now, it would come at an incredible cost, and the logistics of it would be difficult, but it is still worth exploring because it would allow us to capture water that now is being lost and allow it to be used to take pressure off the Ipswich River, particularly in the summer. And Erin's slides emphasize that in the summer, the river comes under an incredible amount of stress. And that's why it originally was ranked the 10th most endangered. Unfortunately, and this is a sad statistic, over the last couple of years, it's moved to number 8 most endangered from the association that makes those designations. So we said, okay, let's look at a reservoir. The second one, to be honest, is a little bit more sensitive. And that is the idea of connecting to the MWRA either on an itinerant basis or on a permanent basis. What do I mean by that? There's been some discussion that maybe we connect to MWRA, but we only draw from MWRA when the river reaches a crisis state, not on a permanent basis. But while we're studying it, we want to look at the whole thing and say, should we look at a more permanent connection or any combination in between? Both of those things depend on interconnections. In other words, it wouldn't be feasible to bring water from the reservoir into only one community or water from MWRA into one community. So we're also looking at interconnections between all the communities. And one of the things that's important is that Hamilton did get what's called a SWIMMY grant, working with the Beverly-Salem Water Board and IRWA to look at some of those interconnections. At the task force, we're taking that to the next level and looking at how could we interconnect all of the communities to wheel water either from a reservoir or from MWRA. Now, if it comes from a reservoir, there's also the issue of what do you do about treatment? Do you deliver raw water to the communities, or do you deliver finished water to the communities? And that question has taken on significantly more importance with the awareness that we've been getting about PFAS. So when you look at the cost of treating for PFAS, you say maybe it would be a good idea to reach economies of scale to treat the water centrally before delivering it to the communities and requiring them all to treat it on their own. But it's also not that simple. We also need to look at the water chemistry in each community to make sure that it would be compatible if we were trying to supply finished water treated for PFAS. Okay, so we got new supply, we got interconnection. One of the other tasks that we're embarked on is to look at what do any of those things do to the river? So we're developing a model to say we're going to be able to look at these options and in the future other options to model what they do to stream flow, particularly what they do to stream flow in the summer. Because remember, part of the equation here is not just to look at supplying drinking water, it's also to look at the health of the river. So we're going to model stream flow and get a better understanding of that. Now, along the way, obviously, if we want to contemplate regional action, we need to know what the communities are doing. So a third study that is now underway as a result of the task force subcommittee on earmarks is to look at what communities have in mind right now. Are there big projects that are being planned? So for instance, at some point, Beverly is going to need to do a new treatment plan. And the question is, if Beverly commits to that treatment plan, is that the best thing? Because if that investment is made, does it preclude Beverly from joining in a regional effort for some of the rest of this? So we're trying to understand all of the projects to see how they work together and understand the time frame of what a regional effort would require. So all of those studies that I just described are out there. They should be completed by the fall. And our hope is that by the fall, we're going to have a lot of information to begin to have an informed discussion about what to do next. So that's part of it. And then there's another piece of it. Part of, if you read our charter statement, you'll see that we wanted to take on the task of a joint narrative of all of us together saying, here's what the problem is, and here's what we're committed to doing together. Now that may seem simple until you realize that for decades there has been contention about what to do in the Ipswich River watershed. And I want to give particular credit here to Joe Demelowitz, the town administrator in Hamilton, and also to our own representative, Kristen Kasner, who served on that subcommittee along with many others. And Aaron, that's right. And I got to tell you, and I'll let them speak for themselves, it was a very big challenge, very big, to get everybody to sit together, see eye to eye, try to agree on some things. And by the way, there was not universal agreement on everything. This was an attempt to come up with a narrative that said, here's where we are, here's where we're going. And these folks and many others did a tremendous job at working through that narrative. And I am so pleased that recently that narrative was adopted by the full task force. Again, things that have never happened before. Things that if you suggested them before, someone would say, you better go get some therapy before you think about this any further. And so we crossed that hurdle, and that narrative got developed, and we're working on that. So we've got studies out that are funded that we hope to have back by the fall. We've got a joint narrative. We've got a charter statement. And the most recent committee that's been created, subcommittee by the task force, is about conservation. So we had a lot of presentations that were made to us at a couple of our meetings about innovative things that communities were doing for conservation. And frankly, I thought I knew a fair amount about this subject. I learned a lot, and I personally was impressed. And so we decided that the subject was so important that it deserved its own subcommittee. And so we formed one. And that subcommittee is going to examine how communities can work together on joint conservation efforts. And it may be as simple as engaging in education, public awareness. Some of that already happens thanks to IRWA and the League and others, but maybe we could do it together in a better way. But it may even be more than that. It may be the bulk purchase of water restrictors and different plumbing pieces of apparatus that could be distributed at a low-cost way. So we're looking at that, and we've marched forward. One of the last things, and you'll be glad to hear me say one of the last things I'm going to talk about, one of the last things is this notion of MWRA, because it's been in the news a little bit lately, because MWRA and the Speaker of the House has also had an interest in this, has been looking at where they could go south of Boston and north of Boston. They have extra capacity, and they would like to put that capacity to work. However, there is a long way to go between here and there, because deciding to join the MWRA is a big decision. Here's one of the things you won't necessarily read about, and it's why we are studying it in addition to the studies that they've done. The MWRA study of coming to the North Shore presumed that the MWRA would build completely new infrastructure to every city and town. Well, first of all, the conservative estimate is that would take 25 years. And I won't even tell you the cost estimate because we'd have to call 911 because a number of people would pass out. So we're trying to say, look, we get that study, and it's good in terms of talking about supply and the ability to supply us, but it is not good to realistically look at cost and implementation. We can't wait 25 years. That's why our study is not redundant. We're looking at trying to say, how could we do this through a series of interconnections and wheel the water, which would be much more efficient? So we're at a point with the task force, again, credit to a lot of folks, and you should all know that Hamilton and Wenham have both been incredibly engaged participants in this process, incredibly engaged. And when we have meetings, we have incredible attendance. We don't have a lot of absenteeism. We have a lot of passion, but we are forging a path that I would suggest to you humbly has never been seen before. And we know what lies ahead. We know what we have to do. And one thing I think it's important is we always need to consider the perspective of the water suppliers. These are the folks, primarily municipal officials, who have the responsibility of every day making sure that when we turn on the tap, water comes out. And they're under a lot of pressure, they have a lot of responsibility, and we always need to make sure that they're part of our conversation as well. And through the task force, they are. So, two quick things at the end. Number one, we're about to release our annual report. I have it in draft copy here. I hope no one will try to take a picture of it and put it on the internet tonight. But that's been largely approved, but it's about to go out. And the most exciting news is that we're about to launch a website where you can read everything I just told you and so much more and read updates. And that's being, again, hosted by MAPC. And we're so grateful to them for the work that they've done. So I really appreciate being able to talk about this. As you can tell, I'm really shy about talking about it and a bit reserved. But it is heartening to see that we have a regional problem like this. And most folks would say it's intractable. And most folks would say you'll never get everybody to the table. It's not intractable. Everybody's at the table. We're finding a way forward. There are going to be some difficult decisions. Funding all of this is going to be very challenging when it comes to infrastructure. But we see a lot of money flowing from Washington with regard to infrastructure. We're hoping the timing will be right to bring those things together. So I want to turn it over to my legislative colleague, but not before thanking all of you for your interest and for listening to what we've had to say tonight. Thank you.
What do I press? Just here it goes. So just these. Okay. Thank you. I am so happy to be here. Thank you to the League of Women Voters. Just going to say this is one of my favorite panels and topics to talk about, but then I said, well, do I have to say that every time? But no, it truly is.
anyway, as many of you know, because I probably knocked on your door, running in 2022 was an interesting time. It was, I would say, the worst drought in a decade, but as Erin mentioned, it's the worst drought, since 2016, and then 2020, and then 2022. So water quickly became the number one topic that I spoke about every day. In the campaign, it started to become the number one topic I spoke about as a new legislator. And today we still talk about water every day. But it's one of the wonderful thing is through the work of the task force and Senator Tarr, the early conveners to bring us together, we all, to get everyone involved and all the stakeholders involved and be at the same table, be with the Ipswich River Watershed, with the River Alliance, with all the water boards. I mean, we speak a different language, but then coming together, we have learned to speak the same language together to figure this all out because it affects every single one of us every day. So it's been a true honor to be on the task force and be part of the Joint Narrative Subcommittee, which I don't know if a caterpillar might move faster than some of the conversations we had, but they were so important. They were slow, they were tedious, but they were successful. Did we have 12 meetings? Did we have 22 hours of discussion? Yeah. Or something like that. But it was, but to have the Joint Narrative Task Force agree on what the issue was, what water withdrawal and the effects on the ecosystem was. I mean, the last meeting we had a couple months ago, and the day we stood together to give the subcommittee report to the task force was, I don't know, after spending that amount of time, it was just truly a monumental moment of everyone coming together and swimming in the same direction. And it's been truly, it's coming from my work in planning and community development. When you get this many people in the room, when you get that many people around the table, momentum starts to happen. And I think what we're seeing is that momentum. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about tonight, hopefully not repeat too much that's already been said from these wonderful speakers, but talk about legislation, some of the studies which Senator Tarr already spoke about, and some of the funding that's been coming in. So as many of you are aware, there's been the drought bill, which has been through a number of sessions. I will say, and it's been sponsored by Rep. Moschino and Senator Eldridge. They wrote an opinion in the Globe on March 25th, 2024 about Massachusetts needs a regional drought plan. It is getting traction. It got voted out of committee. I think, again, it's the momentum. And what this bill, and I'm not going to read the whole slide, but really codifying the existing drought management task force into statute, things we're already trying to do collectively together, and also and then requiring regional water conservation measures during drought. And as mentioned, 1864, early 1900s, some of the early 1980s. I mean, with the patchwork of regulations that are on top of who gets what and where and why and when and what they have to do is complicated, is probably a too simplistic word to describe, as Erin had mentioned. But working through that, but really talking about this all together. Since I'm here, I can't not talk about it. But also in 2022, one of the first places I went was the Ipswich River Watershed Association. I also had been speaking with them as part of work on your master plan here in Hamilton as the vice chair of that committee. But the things that we had talked about during that drought quite a bit, and what the watershed was talking about was the definition of safe yield, as well as looking at safe yield which within the subbasins, not just we have 6 watersheds, the larger watersheds, but instead of the subbasin districts. And then the last piece that became I didn't expect, but the lack of information that we have on private wells and what the withdrawals are in private wells in this region, and thank you to the Ipswich River Watershed for enlightening me on some of that draw. But I mean, we have this watershed, and and the water boards are drawing water for all of us and drinking water. And then we have private wells in a lot of different places, but it's all the same glass of water. It's just another straw. So I knock on doors, they say, oh, I have a private well. I can do it. I can water my lawn. It's still the same water. But really just trying to understand that and trying to understand how can we better get data about withdrawal on the private well level is something that certainly, I mean, if in this particular bill, that's the piece that has become very evident that it's something that we can do with the task force and try to, if we can't measure it, it's hard to solve it. So just to try to get some of that data on the smaller water sources that are actually not smaller it's not just the single family homes. So, and that piece also got voted favorably out of committee, which as a first year legislator, I was very, very happy and proud of. And so moving on, and I won't touch on these too much because Senator Tarr already spoke about them, but the two studies that have been completed, both in 2022, this is the SWIMI report that was completed to look at improving water supply resiliency within the lower Ipswich watershed and the town of Hamilton, but also looking at the connections in order to get water distribution throughout the region. At the time, especially during drought, we were having a lot of conversation about, do we have enough water for emergency water? And trying to figure out how to look at infrastructure and the water infrastructure. You know, in New England, as you may imagine, we built water infrastructure a long time ago. There's still a lot of that infrastructure that's in the ground that's carrying our water. So this was a critical report to look at those connections. And I'll talk a little bit more as I move on. The other study that was completed, that was mentioned, was the MWRA water system expansion. And the study was very much like, we don't have any infrastructure here now, so let's create all new, which of course was an extraordinary cost. But I think between these two studies and the discussions in the task force, what it begins to map out is there is definitely probably a multifaceted way to look at, and multi-solutions to look at how we're looking at water to serve the region. I just wanted to go to the one slide in here that I thought was really illustrated some of the connection point, was this slide within the study from MWRA that looked at, so the purple is the study communities in the Ipswich River watershed, but what you can see south of us, that there already are communities that are served by MWRA. So when you talk about, do we look at all of our communities being served, as mentioned, like what's the water compatibility? You know, if some of our communities were served or connected, if Salem connected into Lynn or Peabody, and then again, if we had the reservoir in Topsfield, but it's really, this slide I thought really illustrated that where MWRA already serves and where some options are. As you can also see that I think Wilmington right now is going fully into MWRA. Burlington, I know, has moved fully into MWRA. And it has been interesting because I spent most of my career at the head of the Ipswich River in Burlington and spoke a lot and brought a lot of pictures from my community of what it means to all those people that are complaining about that they can't water their lawn all summer for this watershed. Let's see. The next piece, as mentioned, if we have momentum, we're talking about this, leadership is talking about this. This article in Commonwealth Beacon magazine was just this March 2024, looking at our watershed, our issues. There's definitely through all of these efforts, through all of you, through all of us talking about this and discussing the issues and the need, a joint conversation of how do we better serve Eastern Massachusetts, and especially within the areas that have issues with water source, water, and river watersheds that are in distress. And with that, good news, conversation's still moving. Hopefully at some point the task force, and we can have this a larger conversation. Another excellent news this month, just a couple of days ago. Mass DEP awarded $2.3 million to 7 of the Ipswich River communities. Including Hamilton. You can see here, and this was, so the Hamilton was $232,000 to analyze, permit, and design a new interim water supply connection between Hamilton and Wenham to ensure the supply from the Salem Beverly Water Supply Board on an emergency and possible long-term basis. And a lot of other connections that are critical within the district. Also, Hamilton has been working with Moulton's office to see if there's any potential earmark dollars to look at that connection, because the task force is very much still looking at source, and is it the reservoir, but what we know is we need to provide the connections. And Hamilton just submitted with Moulton to try to figure out a $1.7 million grant toward that effort, which we'll see, so cross our fingers. And the last slide I had was just highlighting that there's quotes from the Energy and Environmental Affairs Secretary Rebecca Tepper noting that we are one of the most distressed water sources, and we serve 350,000 people. And just to highlight again that there's a tension here. I think when you have a tension, there's opportunity, and we know opportunity doesn't come by appointment. So what can we do to prepare for what we need to be doing and grab that momentum to feed the momentum, but grab opportunity when it's in front of us to really solve this very, very regional problem together. So thank you very much for having me, and wonderful to be on this panel with
So I know the library is very strict about the closing time, but we do have a couple minutes to answer questions if anyone has questions for any of us. Go ahead.
I can't help but ask, you are aware that the school district is planning to put 5 acres of PFAS down. And there's a big fight going on in town right now. There's a group of people trying to convince them that grass is bad. Well, clearly, the Miles River will be totally contaminated. I can swear to that because the water comes right through my property and into the 2 ponds on my property. And it's racing through I should bring a video for you to see how much water comes off that plant. 5 acres of PFAS, think of that. And we already had one girl taken off service in Hamilton because of the PFAS levels.
And I could add that Masconomet High School, which is upstream on the Ipswich River, is also doing the same thing, or wants to. So I don't know. I think it would be great if people that are concerned about this write to the Boxford Conservation Commission, because they're going to make the decision on whether these fields are going to be built or not.
I would also note, just on the question of PFAS, one of the challenges that our local communities who are concerned about this have is the lack of enforceable regulation around PFAS. Towns are limited by what they can and cannot permit or prohibit based on what the law is. And so I would also encourage you to support legislative efforts at state and federal levels around these issues if you're concerned about it, because you really need enforceable limits to be able to empower towns to make those decisions.
So I'd say, number one, we are aware of these proposals, and number two, there is legislation pending. I'm not sure what its status is. We haven't checked in the last couple of days because we're in the period where committees are reporting or not. And so we'd be happy to share information with the league that maybe that could be distributed, but there's at least a couple of bills relative to bans on the use of artificial turf in various circumstances. So it's not only a conversation at the local level, it's a conversation on Beacon Hill as well.
Just to add to that, because I have asked the question within this week. There is one bill that I know that had been, it's in third reading at this point, did make it out of committee on the I want to say it's 3948, I think. But anyway, it's sitting in third reading. And it's the bill that would prohibit municipalities from installing artificial turf and have some date limits. The date limits, and maybe the senator can illuminate, but
From the past.
are from the past, which had been, and I don't have a firm answer from House Counsel on if the past, but likely in third reading, they would look at a date in the future, because if you did something legally, you can't go back with a new law and say it wasn't at that time.
Yeah.
So, but at this point, what I understand is it's not scheduled or connected with another bill at this point. And the dates would presumably be revised at the time that it would be passed.
So the Committee on Bills in the third reading would make technical changes of that nature so that it wasn't an ex post facto law, which would be unconstitutional.
Right.
But also the bill would be subject to floor debate as well. So there could be other amendments that are entertained. So that's something to keep an eye on as we go forward.
I really appreciate your presentation and the work you're doing on this effort, sincerely. And I'm not sure how many smaller watershed areas there are in the Ipswich watershed area. I draw water from Chabaco watershed. My well taps into and many of my neighbors, and outside of this district, Manchester and Essex as well. I'm not sure in the region how many other smaller watershed areas there are. My concern and question is around, and it ties into the PFAS, but it's also in all of the development, we have such conflicting interests going on right now in the region. And I think on the state level, it seems like there's some pieces not communicating from what I can see. And it's the conservation efforts, it's the development of huge developments in pristine areas to tear down trees and ledge and blast that are sensitive watershed areas. And I'm hearing conversations about all kinds of conservation efforts in the state, but then I'm seeing these large developers going in with their projects and bypassing the local bylaws to get to the state, and the state considering putting these massive developments for wealthy people, but tacking on a little 40B, tacking on 10% 40B, so all of a sudden it bypasses the towns and goes to the state. That seems like, I feel like we're in a really interesting time, because they're going to get these through and there's going to be grandfathered in, and then we're going to see the damage to the watershed and the water supplies. So I'm very concerned that the state, and you can certainly answer this better than my instinct, but is not talking to each other around the conservation efforts versus the actual on the ground impact that's going to be happening. And the 40B, the MBTA, all of that together, they're all competing interests. And it really seems like it's going to get through, things are going to pass through us. And then we'll say, oh, damn, we should have done something about that ahead of time.
So I would just say your points are extremely well taken. And I want to say it's good to see Ani Sarkisian here, who's been very active in the Chabaco watershed and a part of another task force as well that I chair. And so we think that watershed is important as well. And it may be restating the obvious, but our goals of housing production could well be at odds with the sustainability of our water supply. And we do need to have more cross conversation about that. And over the years, a number of us, and Representative Kastner is new, so she hasn't been necessarily involved in these conversations yet, but we have had conversations about the need for Chapter 40B comprehensive zoning permits to allow consideration of the ability to supply sustainable water, so that we don't continue to perpetuate that conflict. But there's no doubt about it that we need housing, but I am also quick to tell folks in these conversations, you can't have housing without water, and you can't have housing without wastewater treatment. And so I think we could do better. There are a lot of those conversations happening right now on Beacon Hill, but I agree with you.
but it moves slowly.
It does. That's
I would just add one of the things that we really push for at IRWA is a concept called water neutral growth. And we have a whole toolkit to help towns think about how you would do this. But the idea is that you can increase your population and develop and not increase your water demand. And there's a number of ways that you can do that. You prohibit in-ground sprinkler systems for new developments. You have developers pay to make other existing buildings more water efficient, and then you can use those water savings for your new development. And there's an excellent parallel there with what we're doing in the energy space, where we're requiring new buildings to be so energy efficient and carbon neutral, so that we can continue to grow and not increase fossil fuel demand. And it's this same idea in water, that we can continue to do the things that we want to do. We just have to be very mindful about how we do it.
And just the last piece to add on to that is exactly this kind of conversation and looking at withdrawals on the sub-basin to make sure that the withdrawals and the safe yield doesn't stress that it's dependent on the function and storage. Without depleting the source beyond the ability to be replenished naturally. And when you look at safe yield on a really large water basin, it's hard to tell. But at the sub-basin level, you can tell more acutely where those issues are and also measure them. So, and as well as looking at, again, when I mentioned private wells and water withdrawal. And if we're not looking at the smaller water sources, 100 smaller water sources could add up to the one water source that we already collect a ton of data on. But what are those 100 that we don't know, or we are not measuring, or we're not looking at? So that's, I think, a very good conversation for us to be able to look, because as mentioned, when at the state level, it's, well, you're not meeting the threshold, so it's not being necessarily looked at for all those measures. So I think when we're looking at the protection of where the task force is looking to provide safe drinking water, but also protect the environment, what's that level of measurement that we need to know to be able to make the best decisions? The other thing I wanted to mention is the MS4 permits, the stormwater permits that are a federal permit that the state is required to undertake. Those are almost, I think at this point, required to be universally adopted throughout the state. And that has helped quite a bit to ensure that stormwater and runoff from development is not affecting the neighborhood around that development. So it's been really encouraging to see more conversation there and more local regulations in under MS4. And the last thing I wanted to highlight is there's DEP is looking at kind of wetlands 2.0 at this point. They're out for comment in terms of some of the new wetlands regulations. So I would encourage you to look there to see if you have any comment on those.
Yeah, I just had a question about, again, I think the work you're doing here is great. And I just wanted to follow up on what the group said there about the conflict potentially between development projects for more housing and the need for good sustainable drinking water. And I wondered at the state level, as legislators and nonprofit organizations, are there forums? This is great to have this task force of all like-minded people in the sense that they're all interested in water conservation and water quality and sustainability. But are there forums at the state level where the housing director of housing development, the EEA person, the water person, they get together and they actually talk about the same challenges that you described, so we can really get those questions on the table and try to figure out how we can have a sustainable future. I think one of the things that you said, which is really important, is you talked about the lack of funding. And it seems like you have an opportunity here to actually create funding mechanisms for developers so they don't basically take short money and create problems today. And they can think about this in the long term. We can solve all these problems, and somebody else will have to pay for it, not taxpayers.
So I would say one of the things that I think is important is that in the comprehensive permitting process, we don't presume that if you can get the zoning relief you'll need, you'll get the water that you need. And I think that's a flaw in the process. So I think we need to work through that. The kind of conversations that you're describing often happen at the committee level. When someone presents a bill that touches on all of these things, the committee holds a public hearing and you get that kind of a discussion. There are also other times special commissions that are created through legislation to look at these kind of issues. And then there are informal discussions that are convened in various ways at various times. So those conversations are happening. I would suggest to you at the macro level, they maybe aren't happening enough.
But I think, I mean, the work of the task force is looking exactly at drinking water and environmental sustainability. And from the work of the task force and these studies will come recommendations for infrastructure, but also recommendations for potentially different types of regulations. As I mentioned, it's a very complex web of water rights and regulations within the whole country, but within Massachusetts. And I think the recommendations from the studies of looking at those two things with equal importance is going to be critical. And I'm personally very excited to have such a large group come to some of these conclusions in consensus together.
And one thing I would say is we are trying to evangelize the rest of the state. So we've had conversations with Southeastern Mass about creating a task force just like ours. And we're hoping that that will be the next place where we'll see this kind of a regional effort. And then when that one happens, we can plant the seeds somewhere else and so forth. So while we're doing all the work that we're doing, which is intensive, we're also looking at the bigger picture and saying, can we get other regions to adopt the same approach? And hopefully we can.
And I would shout out MAPC, the Metropolitan Area Planning Commission, because they convene a separate, also confusingly called North Shore Task Force for various stakeholders in the region. And we're a part of that task force as well. And so are many of the planners, the town and city planners in the region. And so that is much more cross-pollinating. It's still regional, but it's cross-pollinating across disciplines as well. So they're a great convener for lots of different stakeholders as well.
I think we're going to have to close it down because I know the library has to go home. But I think there are lots of...
We're really good at true and false. Just you know.
It's a quick one. I was wondering, does the Water Resiliency Task Force have like a hotline? Because I'm not talking about neighbors who are watering their lawns, but I'm thinking of specifically an empty building in Beverly along 128 that is corporately owned that had its sprinklers running at high noon on an August day in 2022. And you know that nobody is there, it's empty, it's owned by a huge corporation. Is there anybody that we can call to say 32 Dunham Road is an empty building that's watering their lawn at high noon during the drought? I kept driving past it and I didn't know what to do.
So I just say one of the things that motivates me so much is an experience I had thanks to Irwa years ago where I stood in Reading in the riverbed that was dry and watched water from a sprinkling system wash over the lawn down into the river. We are not an enforcement organization, so we don't have that type of hotline, but certainly we could put you in touch with DEP.
And I would support the drought bill because the drought bill enables the state to enforce those types of conservation mandates. Whereas right now, there's probably nothing requiring them to turn off those sprinklers.
Which goes to the very complex nature and his very historic
Yes.
Water regulations.
Well, thank you all for coming. I'm afraid we do have to close it down.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you all.